This is your brain. Now, there are two sides of the brain that we must understand in order to grasp how our anxiety works. I'm going to divide the column right here. Now, who here can tie their shoelaces? Just raise your hand. Was there a certain time in your life when you didn't know how to tie your shoelaces? So there was a point in your life where you learned how to tie your shoelaces. So we're going to address that in two different sides of the brain. So let's talk about the first side of the brain. This side of the brain is when you are very analytical, when you think about things, when you get thoughts in your head. Now, in an interview situation, right before we go into an interview, what are the thoughts in our head? Our thoughts are, I hope I do well, I'm very nervous, I hope I remember what to say. Can anyone relate to this? Do you get any of these thoughts? Or, I hope they don't ask me any tough questions, I hope they ask me about ABC that I prepared. So you're actively thinking in your mind, okay? So this is the first part of the brain. We'll call this the thinking part of the brain. The job of the thinking part of the brain is to analyze and to break things down into minor, easy to understand concepts. So think about it like a puzzle, and instead of seeing 100 puzzles coming together, the analytical mind analyzes one single piece at a time. So what this is really good for is analysis. It's really good for learning something new. It's really good for giving yourself feedback and judging yourself, feedback and judgment. And it's really good for brainstorming, okay? So anytime where your brain is on and you're actively thinking, this is what's happening. So when you're in class right now, you're consciously paying attention to everything I'm saying. Then you have the other part of the brain. This is the unconscious part of the brain. This is where you operate from 95% of your life. You're not thinking about every single thing in your life, okay? So if I ask you, when you're walking down the street or when you go to the kitchen to drink some water, how much do you think about, okay, I'm going to lift my foot like this. I'm going to grab the fridge door. You're not doing that. Your body just automatically does it. So this part is all automated and you don't have to think. This is very, very key. There's no thinking involved in this process. So unlike the thinking brain, this part is not analytical at all. There's no thinking going on. Instead, it is very intuitive. It just knows how to do it. So when we go back to the tying shoelaces example, when you were learning to tie your shoelaces for the first time, you would think, okay, I have to grab this string like this one like this, You were in the thinking part of your brain. But now when you tie your shoelace, you don't have to think about it anymore. At least I hope for most of you. You don't have to think about when you're tying your shoelaces, correct? It just automatically happens. Or maybe when you're brushing your teeth, you don't have to think about it. It just automatically happens. So this is very, very good for doing many things at the same time. If we go back to the example of walking down the street, you don't have to think about, I'm going to lift my leg like this, I'm going to point my chin here. Your body, all of these different parts of your body combine and they just function together automatically. You don't have to think about it. So this is your unconscious part of the brain. Now, why I mention this is because if you understand what part of the brain is in charge at the moment, it's going to significantly change how you perform. So I'll give you another example, okay? Let's go back to the example of you walking down the street. If I asked you, walk from this side of the street to that side of the street, you would have absolutely no problem because you know how to walk. But if I said, while walking from here to there, I want you to make sure you keep your back straight, your chin is up here, your eyes are pointing here, you have 2 feet between your legs, and your left hand and your right foot are synchronized, and your left foot and your right hand are synchronized, and make sure you're breathing properly while you're doing that. If I gave you all of this extra piece of information, although it might be correct in terms of strategy and technique, do you think you'll do better or worse? Tell me in the chat. If I didn't tell you anything, and if I told you 50 things to do, would you do better or worse? Worse, worse, worse. There we go. But let me ask you this. How many of you are doing this exact thing right before an interview? Right before you go onto the stage? Reviewing your notes, reviewing your speech, holding your cue cards, rehearsing the answer in your head. So this is why when you give yourself more information, you start operating from this part of the brain. You don't want to operate from this part of the brain. You want to operate from this part of the brain because the analytical mind can only do one thing at a time. If you're focused on what am I going to say, I hope they like me, I hope I get an easy question, then the rest of your brain, the 95%, can't remember the information. That's why you blank out. Have you ever had this situation where you prepared for an exam, you prepared for an interview, you knew everything, but the moment it started, you forgot everything? You couldn't remember anything. You got very nervous, you got overwhelmed. And then the moment the interview ended, the moment you stepped off stage, all of it came back to you. Has that ever happened to anyone? Let me know in the comments. There we go. So this is how your brain works, okay? Think about your brain like it has 10 GB of storage. Let's say 10 GB of storage. And you practice and practice and practice. What you're doing is while you're thinking, you're filling up that storage in the brain. So you're preparing for an interview, you remember all your questions, you come in with 10 GB of information. Now you're at the interview, and right before the interview, you're thinking, I hope I remember the question, I hope they like me, I hope I pass, I can't fail this interview, I don't have anything else lined up. Because your brain only has so much storage and you have all of these extra things to think about, your brain says, we need to make room for all of these extra concerns. Let's delete all of the information so that we can store all of this extra stuff in here. So that's why when we show up to an interview and we're nervous, we don't remember anything. And the moment the interview is over, all of that information comes back to us. This is why it's so important to know which side of the brain you're on, okay? So in interview preparation, in public speaking preparation, the thinking part is very good for preparation. It's very good for learning, and these are the questions I'm going to get, these are the answers that I have to give. That part is really good. It's also very good after the interview. How did I do? They asked me this question, how could I have done it? You're brainstorming. But when you're in the flow, or when you're right before the interview, you do not want to be thinking. Because if you're thinking, 95% of your body and your memory does not work. Okay? This is why it's so important to understand these two analogies. Now, when you are thinking, it also brings judgment. It also brings analysis. How much of this has happened to you? And I know I can speak for myself. Maybe you go to a networking event, or maybe you meet someone for the first time and you're a little shy, you're a little nervous. All of a sudden you start getting these thoughts in your head. Oh, you don't know what to say, you don't know anyone here, this is boring, there's no point being here, let's just go home. Or maybe right before an interview you start getting those thoughts. Does that ever happen? Do you ever have those internal dialogue? Yes or no? Give me a yes or no in the comments. If that is happening with you, that's you in the thinking brain. The language of the thinking brain is words and sentences and dialogue. So every time you hear yourself talking to yourself, you know you're in the thinking brain. Again, if you're practicing, amazing. But if you're in an interview and you find yourself criticizing yourself, giving yourself feedback on the spot, you'll be much, much worse. It's like having a spotlight on you the entire time, okay? How do you know you're in your unconscious brain? Let's talk about that, because that's where you want to be. Think about when you are with your friends, when you're having the most amount of fun in your life, when you're playing an instrument, when you are playing a sport, how often are you thinking in that moment? Really think about that. How often are you thinking about your next move? You'll find almost never. You're almost never actively occupied with the next thing to say. So when you do your best, you don't think. But when you think, you don't do your best. The reason I talk about this is because if you can understand how to go from the thinking brain to the unconscious brain, you will start performing 95% better right away. So don't you think that's a tool worth learning? Yes or no? What do you think? Let me know if you'd like to learn how to go from the thinking brain to the analytical brain and tap into your potential. Yes or no? There we go. Okay, let's get into it. So, couple of things. A lot of people, when they get nervous right before an interview, and by the way, who doesn't get nervous? I get nervous. I'm nervous right now. Everyone gets nervous. They think something is wrong. Who else thinks that? Just raise your hand. Like, something is wrong. Why is this happening? I don't want it to happen. Raise your hand if you feel like that. Okay, very, very honest. I feel like that too, okay? If I told you something that you experience is the default response to the situation, all of a sudden it becomes less irritating. So if I told you, if you're going skydiving and when you jump out of the plane, your heart's gonna beat out of your chest. So when you actually go and jump off a plane, you're not going to be surprised that your heart's beating out of our chest. But for some reason, when we do public speaking and the same thing happens, all of a sudden we say, oh, why am I such a terrible public speaker? Why is this happening? Why am I an introvert? Why do I have this personality? All of a sudden, we turn it into a personality trait. Like it's something wrong with us. I know I've done it. If someone else has done it, let me know in the comments too. But we take it very, very personally. But if I told you, this is just the way your body responds to the situation, all of a sudden, it's not that difficult. So let's understand how the body works in that regard, okay? I'm gonna make a quick chart here. You're about to start your presentation. This is when your anxiety is starting to ramp up. It's getting higher and higher and higher. And let's say you start your presentation here. This is most likely when your anxiety is at the peak. And then as you start to go on, it starts to go down a little bit like so. But here's the biggest mistake most people make. The thinking brain turns on. And then it starts analyzing. Oh, people are looking at you. You're doing a terrible job. Am I answering this correctly? Am I looking correctly? All of a sudden, because you're thinking, this anxiety goes right back up. And then it comes back down, and then it goes right back up. So what tends to happen is there's this infinite loop of anxiety where you get anxious, and then just when it starts to go down and your mind turns on, oh my God, I can't believe people are looking at me. And then it turns into a spiral. So if you just cut off this part here, where you start to question and criticize yourself, this anxiety, public speaking or interview anxiety, will only last about 60 to 90 seconds. So if I told you, before every interview, before every time you step on stage and give a presentation, all you need to do is give yourself 60 seconds to experience anxiety. It will happen. You cannot remove it. It will 100% happen, but it will only take 60 seconds. Do you think it will be easier to swallow that? Like, yeah, I can get done with 60 seconds, right? That's not too much. So if I can just teach you how to not criticize yourself, how to not be in your thinking brain, automatically all you have to do is just survive the first 60 seconds. Is that more doable than 30 minutes of anxiety? Yes or no? I'm seeing some head nods, right? Okay, let's get to the magic question then. How do you go from the thinking brain to the analytical brain? So if we're going from thinking to analyzing, and by the way, I do have the best writing in the world, so if you can't understand what's written, just let me know, I'll type it out in the comments for you. This is thinking, this is analyzing. One thing to remember, you can never think yourself out of a problem that thinking creates. Have you ever had the situation where you're getting anxious before an interview and you start talking to yourself? You're never gonna do well. You suck. You're terrible. Oh no, I am very good. No, you're terrible. No, I'm very good. And at the end of it, you somehow win the argument, and the anxiety goes away. It never happens. Literally never happens. So let's say this anxiety in your mind, this analytical person in your mind, let's pretend this is another person entirely. Okay, let's give it a name. Let's give this person the name Bob. Your job is just to take note what Bob says to you every time you are doing something difficult. So for example, right before an interview, you might get thoughts, what if I forget? What if I suck? What if I didn't prepare? The question is going to be really hard. We tend to take these things as facts. This is just true. It must be true. If I'm thinking about it, it has to be true. But instead, I want you to shift the analogy a little bit. I want you to pretend like there's someone in your brain named Bob whose job is to put doubt in your mind. That's the only thing Bob will do. So if you start engaging in conversation with Bob, it creates more tension. Now you're in an argument with yourself. So you don't want to do that. You just want to say, oh, Bob's doing that thing again. Bob's trying to doubt me into this process. Bob's trying to throw me off. This is what Bob is hired to do. I understand what they're doing. When you see a magician for the first time and they do the trick in front of you, you're blown away. Oh my God, what an amazing trick. But what if you figured out how they do the trick and then you saw the trick again? All of a sudden, the way you respond to it changes. You're not very impressed. You see right through it and you're no longer falling for the tricks. I want you to treat your thoughts the exact same way. When you know something is going to happen, when you know it's not you, it's that part of your brain that's trained to criticize you, it becomes a lot easier. So that's number one. When you get those thoughts in your head, realize this is not me. This is that critique in my brain. Its job is to put doubts in my head. This is not real. Number two, what we want to do is we want to shift our attention from thinking to movement. By movement, I mean movement in your body, movement in your senses, something that is changing around you. So I'm going to give you a quick exercise right now to demonstrate this, okay? Those of you who have anxiety, just take the next 10 seconds, think about the worst possible thing that can happen in an interview. Maybe you're really afraid of an interview preparation. Maybe an interview went really terribly in the past. Take 10 seconds and just bring it to the forefront right now, okay? Just think about it. Let's stop. Now we're going to play a very quick game, and you will need to pay attention to this 100% of the way. Listen to every single word I say, okay? I'm going to read from a book, and I want you to tell me how many times the letter T occurs in what I'm saying. Okay? So I'm going to talk, I'm going to read from the book. Your job is to count how many times you hear the letter T. Does that make sense? Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. Okay, so pay very, very close attention. I'm gonna do this for about 20-25 seconds. Okay, ready? Jobs asserted his control of the group by canceling a brown bag lunch seminar that was scheduled to give him the whole company. Raskin happened to go by the room anyway and discovered that there were 100 people that were waiting to hear him. Now in the chat, let me know how many T's you heard. 8, 6, okay. 3, interesting. 15, you gotta find the margin. Lost count. Okay, this time I'm going to go a little slower. I want you to note how many times the letter R occurs in my words. Let's try it again. Jobs thought that they didn't exhibit much taste. The Microsoft programmers were persistent. They came out with applications that were terrible. Jobs recalled, but they kept at it and they made them much, much better. How many R's did you hear? 9, 10, 5, 10, 5. Such a wild discrepancy, isn't it? 10, 10, okay. Now the bad news is, I don't know how many R's or T's there were, so we will never know. But the good news is this. How many of you were paying attention to that thing that was making you anxious about 2 minutes ago? That thing that you were thinking about that brought you a lot of anxiety? Were any of you thinking about that during this exercise? No. This, folks, is the power of focus. When you can go from the thinking mind to doing something that occupies all of your attention, your mind no longer has time to be anxious. So just in this moment, as you went from bringing up something that made you very anxious to completely forgetting about it for the next 2 minutes, you can train yourself to focus. When you train yourself to focus, you go from the thinking mind to the unconscious mind. So the question is, how do you bring yourself to focus? You have to bring yourself to focus by focusing on something you can see, something you can say, something you can hear, all of your attention, all of your individual senses. So I'm gonna bring all of this together and show you how you can step by step prepare for an interview using this concept, and I'm gonna show you how to focus as well. So we're gonna do a quick checklist. You have an interview coming up. Let's say you've got an interview coming up in about 14 days, okay? Step 1 is the preparation phase. Now, big difference between preparation and practice. Preparation is when you put the material together. Practicing is when you say it out loud. A lot of people will put the material together, they'll know the questions, but they will never practice saying it out loud. I can tell you with 100% confidence, if you only prepare and don't practice, you're behind 95% of people. Right away, I'll tell you that. So, preparation, we have to use our thinking mind, our analytical mind. How are we going to do that? When you have an interview coming up, you go to Glassdoor, you go anywhere where you can find the list of questions, or you even go to ChatGPT. Let's say you've got a recruitment coordinator role that you're trying to apply for. You'll go to ChatGPT or you'll go online. I'm sure, David, you have some resources too. And you will ask, what are the top 10 to 15 questions that they always ask? And by the way, these are standard, most of them are very standard. Every now and then they'll ask a different question. So for example, tell me about yourself. How would you deal with a difficult coworker? Do you have any knowledge about Excel? Those types of questions, or situational questions. So what you're going to do is you're going to make a list of all of these questions. How this, why this, what that. And for each one of them, you're just going to write down the answer. And you're going to write down in 1 or 2 sentences, not the whole exacting scripting. You're not going to do that. 1 to 3 sentences that just reminds you of it. And ideally, make it a story. So for example, if the question is, tell me about a time that you had a difficult experience with a customer or a coworker. What you don't want to do is in the interview, be thinking about what story this is, because you're not going to come up with the right story. Even when you have the right story, you won't know the structure, you won't know how to talk about it properly, it won't sound good. So you want to do this well ahead of time. So 1 to 3 sentences, you can just write story about Mary, when you had a bad experience with Mary. So just make a whole cheat list of this, okay? So by the end of this will take you about an hour to do most, and it will serve you in every single interview. You will have, by the end of it, 10 to 15 questions and 10 to 15 answers. Just about every single question they can ask you, you have that already ready. This is the preparation phase, okay? So you prepared for the interview. Now, do not make this a mistake where you just go into the interview with this much practice, which, by the way, a lot of people don't even do this. So if you're doing this, you're ahead of most people right away. Now, we go into the practice stage. In order to practice, there must be repetition. Repetition means doing the same thing over and over again. So now what you're going to do, you're going to open this list and you're going to read every single question, but you're not going to memorize all of the answers. You're going to look at your cheat sheet, you will read the question, you will look at the, oh yeah, that story about Mary, okay, let me try saying it out loud. Then you'll say the answer out loud. You can record yourself on your phone as well, that way you can watch it back. So for each one of these questions, these 10 to 15 questions, say each of them out loud at least 5 times. At least 5 times. And you realize the 5th time you say it and the first time you say it, there's a gigantic difference between the quality of the answer. Because as you start saying it out loud, you realize that sounds wonky, that didn't really sound good, that didn't really come across correctly, and you start editing yourself. So what you don't want to do is go into the interview for the first time, say that answer out loud, and it sounds terrible. You want to get all of the bad takes out of the way. So you will practice with repetition over and over and over and over again. By this point, what's going to happen is your brain will take all of this conscious practice from your thinking brain into your unconscious brain, because your unconscious brain does it better than your thinking brain, okay? So we have all of this information that we learned about the questions and the answers in the thinking brain. My writing is winning an award today. This is thinking brain, okay? Thinking brain, thinking Brian, whatever. You understand what I'm saying. So all of the information is stored here. Now what we need to do during an interview, we want to make sure we can access this information. So if you prepared and you did all this repetition, remember what I said about the storage example? If right before the interview, you start taking your notes and revising, you start practicing, you start thinking about what to say, maybe you're in the bathroom and you're revisiting your notes, all of a sudden you're going right back to the thinking brain. If you're there, you can't think fast, your brain can't put words together, you will blank out. So now we practice focus, okay? How do I distract myself? That's the only goal of focus. How do I distract myself so that I'm not actively thinking? Because you can't think yourself out of your thinking. What I like to do is pay attention to a couple of things. One, you can pay attention to your breathing. So pay attention to your inhale and your exhale. So literally before I go on stage, when I'm sitting, before I go on stage in a conference or a keynote, I'm just going inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. And I'm saying that in my head, inhale, exhale. And the reason I do this is because my mind is occupied. And if my mind is occupied, then my thinking brain is shut off and I'm using my intuition. I'm using the part of my brain that has learned the skill. When you do something over and over again, it is in your unconscious brain, not in your thinking brain. So that's where you want to access it, okay? Now, what will happen, you can practice on your breathing. Some people like focusing on their phone, maybe going through Instagram. It's the only time in your entire life where I would actually recommend scrolling social media, because the moment you start doing it, you forget everything else. You get so lost in cat videos and memes that nothing else pays attention. What you can also do, this is an exercise a friend of mine does, he just says things out loud that he sees. So he'll say red carpet, blue suit, yellow whatever, and because he's so focused on saying it out loud, the mind stays distracted. Whatever is easiest for you, try that out to keep yourself distracted. Now, when you're in the interview, you might be distracted at first, then you start answering from your intuition, and then over time, you'll get asked a question and maybe the answer wasn't very good, or maybe you didn't quite do well. Thinking brain comes back on. Hey, that was terrible. How dare you answer like that? That wasn't the answer we practiced. How did you? Now you have to realize Bob is doing that thing again. I'm realizing because I can hear my thoughts, I'm not in my unconscious brain. I'm in my thinking brain. The more I criticize, the more I make myself nervous, the worse I will do. So you take note of it and you bring your attention right back to your focal point. Your focal point can be listening to the person, your focal point can be your breath, your focal point can be your own words, whatever helps you stay comfortable. It's different for everybody. So this process happens over and over and over again. So you will start talking and then eventually you'll get negative thoughts. You will take note of these negative thoughts. You will bring your focus back to your focus point and then over and over and over again. So the goal is not to not be anxious. The goal is not to try to get rid of the anxious. The goal is not to have an argument with these anxious thoughts. The goal is to realize this is completely normal. This is exactly how the brain functions. I'm not going to give into it. I'm going to recognize it, bring my focus right back. Recognize it, bring my focus right back. If you're able to do this, not only have you gone through the process of preparing, where you know all of the questions, you've also then gone through the process of practicing out loud so you know what the words sound like. You've internalized the material in your head so you don't have to think about it. A lot like tying your shoelaces, it just becomes second nature. And when you can learn to focus, that way you can access all of that information. You won't blank out. You won't have that agitated feeling right before a presentation or an interview.